first item under old business is our administrative rules update, and I'm assuming that's you, Steph.
We drafted rules, and we went to the Board of Regents in June of last year. The board authorized the president to request from the governor approval to hold public hearings on our rules, and that is a requirement under Chapter 91 for rulemaking in the state. We held public hearings in September, the 24, 25, 26, and 28 in Honolulu, Hilo, Waikoloa, and Kahului, respectively. We heard a lot of comments. Most of those comments focused on the topics of traditional and customary practices, preservation of scientific and educational resources, vehicle transportation, etc. And so we went back and reevaluated the rules, and are trying to fine-tune it to address some of the comments that were made by the public. So following the hearings in September, we went back to the Board of Regents to request that we be allowed to amend the rules, and then to allow us to come back to them to approve the new draft. So in the meantime, we've made some changes to the rules, proposed changes to the rules, and we are doing informal consultation with a number of community groups, business groups, UH and UHH, Native Hawaiian faculty, as well as DLNR. We have consulted with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs on a number of occasions. We are trying to consult with them one more time before we go back to the Board of Regents. Based on these informal consultations, we will make further revisions if we feel that it is needed. We plan to go back to the Board of Regents on April 18th to seek their approval, once again, to go out for public hearings with the proposed new draft. So this is just a list, it's just some of the rules, but this is to show that a lot of the rules, our rules, are basically DLNR rules. They're just, it's almost a mirror image in many cases. And so you can actually put DLNR sometimes on our rules, but most of the rules that you see are what you would find in are very common that you find in most rules: littering, parking, speeding, staying on the trails, protecting the resources. So those are very common in most rules, and they're also in our rules. So based on the comments received, we ended up deleting a couple sections. And one had to do with a section on customary traditional practices. And we, in our consultation with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, they felt that our rules were somewhat overly strict, and had asked us if we could come up with some means for identifying activities that would not be covered by these rules. And so we had a difficult time, and some of it is based on our consultation with Kahuku Mauna about the university or even the council not being in any position to define culture. So we ended up coming up with some language that focused on resource protection, and that if an activity, if a cultural practice was to have some impact on the resources, it was, they would be encouraged to come to OMKM and Kahuku Mauna about getting a special use permit. We heard a lot. We heard a lot about that from the community. They felt that was inappropriate, but I would like to emphasize that nowhere in our rules do not prohibit the exercise of cultural practices, but our rules, the purpose of our rules is to protect the resources and to ensure the health and safety of those visiting the mountain. Also, our rules, we need to be compliant with all other existing rules and regulations and statutes. So, but as a result of the communication and the comments that we received, we decided to delete this section. Instead, we are planning to, based on some other comments, is that we would recognize the constitutional language regarding the rights of Native Hawaiians to exercise their traditional cultural practices, and that their practices are not to be abridged. Okay. Another section had to do with group and public assemblies. And there was a section specifically about if you're going to have a public assembly or large group assembly, that a permit would be required. And that rule came from the state parks, and the state parks has rules about this, and that the state park rules also applies to Mauna Kea. So we adopted that language and included it in our rules. But again, we heard a lot from the public, and we felt that it would be better that we remove the need for a permit and instead require individuals to register if they wanted to have a large assembly or a group assembly. And the reason the state parks do that, you have big parks, primarily in Oahu, where they have a lot of rallies, whether it's for Mothers Against Drunk Drivers or large, big assemblies. So they do require this in their parks. But we're just going to, instead of a permit, we're going to ask people to register with the office. Okay. So another area was vehicle types. We're still going to prohibit the use of two-wheel drive, but we are now expanding it from four-wheel drive to also include all-wheel drive vehicles and not limit it to four-wheel drive. Based on observations by our rangers about bicyclists sometimes falling in the roadway, particularly in the area where it's gravel, their bikes are not designed to ride on gravel roads, and so sometimes they do fall into the roads. And so we felt that maybe we should that we would prohibit that particular use of that activity. But we've been receiving a lot of comments that it was too restrictive, and so instead of prohibiting it, we're going to ask those who want to bicycle to the summit to get a permit from the office. A lot of comments we received from the public about group size, and it's not known to most people, but group size is a natural area reserve rule. And we are, on the west side of our property, we are bordered by the natural area reserve. So to be consistent, we've also adopted their group size limit of 10. And part of the reason for limiting group sizes is when you have a group, people tend not to hike single file. They want to hike in groups, 2 or 3 across, and then you start to widen the trail, and instead of being a very narrow trail, it becomes almost like a roadway. So that's one area. And also, individuals are not, because they're more engaged in some social activity as they're walking or hiking, that they're not particularly paying attention to their surroundings, and that you can also start doing some damage to the natural resources. Another area of a concern was actually rules that would protect the scientific and educational resources, and this had to do with the use of cell phones. And so in discussions with the observatories, they felt that you can use a cell phone, but to have it, as you're in the summit, to put it in airplane mode, because most people use their cell phones not so much to just call people or text, but they also use it as a camera. Another comment we received, a lot of comments received, was about the use of artificial illumination, such as flashlights. And so the observatories thought about this, and they felt that they don't want to ban the use of artificial illumination, such as flashlights or lasers, but to not use them close to when you're near or close to an observatory. And then finally, the use of, it has to do with audio. The DLNR had a rule, and we adopted it verbatim from the DLNR rule, which included, it's primarily, I think it's about protecting the audio landscape. That you want to preserve the sounds of the wilderness. And so DLNR had a rule that says you couldn't use musical instruments. And we received a lot of comments on that. So we decided that we would modify that rule and just prohibit the use of public address systems or systems that would amplify with amplifying devices to help preserve the soundscapes. And then finally, we did hear comments about our fines being overly broad, and as it was concerned to some individuals that if you committed a first offense for something very minor, that you could be fined up to $2,500. And so Act 132 sets the fine schedule for these first offenses, $2,500, second offenses up to $5,000, and the third offense would be up to $10,000. So what we did was review the various sections within our rules, and we broke it down into smaller fine ranges. So, for example, first violation in Chapter 2026-51, your first offense would be for $50 to $400. Things like parking, speeding, we wouldn't assess someone a $2,500 fine. So this is to provide comfort to individuals that they're not going to be assessed something to the amount of $2,500. Okay, so we summarized the changes for you in this little handout, and then a copy of the proposed draft. It doesn't include some of the changes that we might be made based on our informal consultation, but this is what it was as of January 2nd of this year. Are there any questions? The next step is to go back to, we may do a little bit more fine tuning. Then we go back to the Board of Regents on April 18th, and we will ask them for approval to go out for public hearings. Again, yes, second round, yes.
Still have a question regarding the enforcement issue with regards to utilizing an authorized agent or law enforcement. Can you clarify what that really means? An authorized law enforcement agent. Is that DLNR, county?
It could be DLNR, Care, it could be the county police, it could be the sheriffs. Couldn't be the federal agent. But I'm not sure, but anyone who's an authorized legal law enforcement.
But not our rangers, correct?
Our rangers do not have.
Okay.
Stephanie, so then after the public hearing, we have one more public hearing, then what's the next step?
So we're hoping that we won't have to make additional changes, if we do make changes, hopefully they would be minor or minimal, and then we go back to the Board of Regents, ask them to approve the rules, and then from there it goes up the chain. It eventually goes to the governor for his approval. I don't know. End of the year? Well, if we go to the Board of Regents, we're probably looking at the summer, and then from when it goes to the governor, then he has his own process, so that could take several months because he has to send it out to all of his departments for their review. Any other questions?
So maybe in 10 years you'll get two administrative rules.
It is a long process. This is coming back to us as an update. Is there opportunity for the board to provide additional input if they want to at this point? And
At this point?
yeah.
Sure. If you have any comments, or you can always contact the office and submit your comments to the office. But before we go, actually, there was a step that I skipped here. Before we go back to the Board of Regents, then we would go to Kahuku Mauna for their review, and we could come back to this board for its review before we go back to the BOR.
So I would encourage you, to take a look at the rules and offer your comments in whatever way that you would like to.